All right, this presentation is going to do kind of a cursory overview of the hero's life of Heracles, and just by kind of the nature of the beast, we're certainly not going to hit all of the aspects of the narrative surrounding this hero. I think you could make a case that Heracles. We better know him today by kind of the romanization of his name, Hercules, same character. I think you could make a case that Heracles was the most popular of the Greek mythological heroes, both during kind of the heyday of ancient Greece and certainly in the afterlife of the hero in other traditions up to the present day. And how to explain it? I mean, he's a character that finds his way into so many different corners of kind of ancient Greek thought and life and entertainment. He's the quintessential strongman hero. He's a tragic figure. He is also a comic figure known for his appetites for food and wine and sex. He also becomes kind of an everyman. He represents kind of the frailty of every human being and the challenges and tragedies and choices we all face. And so he's one of these figures that really kind of branches out into kind of all corners of culture in a way that really no other hero does. I like to start kind of a look at Heracles with this famous statue. This is the so-called Farnese Heracles, now in the National Archaeological Museum in Naples, Italy. I like it because in many ways it kind of, at a glance, tells us everything we need to know about Heracles. Like this is a massive statue, by the way. I don't have anybody standing in the picture for scale, but roughly 5 to 6 foot person's head would only come up to here. It's a massive statue, and we see Heracles, as this heavily muscled figure. The locus of his power is in his fists and his chest and his biceps and the like. So he's clearly this massively powerful figure, but the artist here, the sculptor, has shown him weary. He's leaning on his club and the lion skin, these common symbols of Heracles. His head is bowed. His face is lined. He's exhausted. He's tired from his labors. So he's at once both an extremely powerful, imposing figure, but he's also someone who is beaten down, is broken, and it is exhausted, is fatigued. And so we see kind of the great kind of mythological divine heroism of the man, but we also see the frailty of his humanity at the same time. And so we'll see aspects of that as we go through kind of the highlights of Heracles' journey. So we begin with his birth story. He is a child of Zeus. He, like so many Greek heroes, he is a demigod. He has a mortal parent, Zeus, and an immortal parent, Zeus should say, and a mortal parent, Alcmena. And as a child of Zeus, of course, he incurs the wrath of Hera, and that's a very important aspect to Heracles' story. In fact, his name is almost a kind of a middle finger towards Hera. You can see in Heracles' name, in the Greek form of his name, you can see the name Hera, and the Cles here is kind of technically the Greek form of his name would be Herakleos, which literally means the glory of Hera. And of course, he's anything but. He's just another reminder of the faithlessness of Zeus when it comes to his relationship with his wife. And so Heracles, like many of Zeus's children, bears children that he has with other women, bears the brunt of Hera's anger because she can't get back at her husband the way that she would like to in an immediate fashion. So she goes after the children, and that's a big part of the curse and tragedy that Heracles carries throughout his life. So I mean, there's a number of versions of this story, but in many ways it's a typical kind of story. Zeus sees Alcmena, falls in lust with her, disguises himself as Amphitryon, her proper mortal husband, and sleeps with her, and she becomes pregnant with Heracles. Now, another kind of wild part of the story is that so Alcmena becomes pregnant. She doesn't realize she's sleeping with Zeus. She thinks she's sleeping with her husband, and then her husband kind of returns and sleeps with his wife, and so she becomes doubly pregnant. And so she's pregnant with twins, and the demigod twin is Heracles, and the mortal twin is Iphicles, born from the same womb but by different fathers. It's that weird biology that only a myth can get away with. And there's also a story, kind of these ironic stories that sets up the curse of Heracles as well. Is that Zeus knows Alcmena is pregnant. He thinks he has a grasp on the future. He proclaims the day on which Heracles will be born will be the day that a great ruler will be born. But Zeus forgets apparently that his wife Hera is a goddess of childbirth, so she prevents Heracles from being born on that auspicious day, and instead this figure from the other branch of the family, Eurystheus, is born, and so that sets up this curse that because of that, Heracles misses that day, and Eurystheus is born on that day. Eurystheus is destined to be the one who will lord it over Heracles, and indeed it's Heracles, when he performs his famous 12 labors, he has to perform them and prove them to Eurystheus before he can get out from underneath one of the many tragic curses that are pronounced upon him throughout his life. This figure Aeolus, sometimes a nephew, a cousin of Heracles in the stories, is someone who steps in to help him along the way, but certainly not a central part to his mythology. Now, as we were talking about kind of typical aspects of the hero's journey last week, one of the things you often find, particularly in masculine stories, is before the hero embarks on his primary quest, often the hero will go through some challenges as a kid, as a young boy, as in Heracles' case, even as an infant, and through his young manhood that give us an inkling of the great heroism to come. I call your attention just to a handful of these. And so one of the famous ones, this was a favorite of ancient artists, is that Hera wants to destroy the child, and so she sends these snakes into the crib to poison, to strangle, to bite at Heracles. But Heracles is already a kind of a strong man, even as an infant baby, and he strangles the snakes with both hands. You can see in this vase painting here, Athena, she plays her classic role as the helper of the hero, and she's there kind of blessing the scene. And here we have baby Heracles, and he's even got his highly developed pecs here. He's already kind of a mini bodybuilder, even as a 2-day-old. And then this is very likely Iphicles, his mortal twin, being pulled out by his mother or his nanny here. So we already see the powerful hero as a baby. Another one of kind of the tragedies of Heracles' life, this is something that follows him throughout, is that it's often an aspect of the strongman hero that they are, we would say, kind of in the terms we've been using, much closer to nature than to civilization. Strong men tend to be kind of wilder. They tend to be more closer to animals. Maybe that's not the best term, but they're more kind of savage, more unpredictable. They're more kind of prone to fly off the handle than the hero from the city. And Heracles, of course, is a strongman hero. One of his principal weapons is a club. It's a very crude weapon. He wears a lion skin. He's very much kind of a caveman in terms of his appearance. But one of the tragedies about Heracles is that the stories depict him as someone who wants to be civilized. He wants to be educated. He wants to get married. He wants to settle down. He wants the quiet, civilized life, but it's something that's always beyond him, or it's snatched away from him. And there's a famous darkly comic story that illustrates this early on. And so as a kid, he's sent off to Linus, the great music teacher, to learn how to play the lyre. This is what good civilized young Greek boys do. But because Heracles is kind of a beast of a boy, and his big, fat, heroic fingers can't pluck the lyre in that delicate way, and Linus was a very harsh teacher. He's playing one bum note after another, and Linus is getting very angry. He's smacking him and telling him, do it again and get it right. And finally, Heracles' anger gets the best of him, and he picks up the lyre and he bashes Linus over the head with him and kills him. So he has this rage about him, kind of this natural savagery that is very difficult for him to control. He wants to control it, but it's beyond him. And then there are other stories that are much more in the kind of the classic Heracles comic vein. And so there's this figure named Thespius who is a wealthy farmer. He has these magnificent herds of sheep, but there's a problem. There's a lion that's coming out of the forest regularly and decimating his flocks. And so he hears about this young kid who's got a way about him, and he hires Heracles to track this lion and ultimately kill it to spare the rest of his flocks. And Thespius meets Heracles, and he sees this magnificent specimen of a human being, and he thinks, well, wouldn't it be great to have the bloodline of this kid in the family? Now it just so happens that Thespius has 50 daughters, 50, as one does, and the story usually goes that Heracles tracks the lion for 50 days and for 50 nights before he kills it. And each of those nights, Thespius sends in another one of his daughters to sleep with Heracles. And Heracles, being the dumb jock that he is, he thinks he's sleeping with the same girl every night. But in fact, he's impregnating each of Thespius' daughters. They all become pregnant from their one night with Heracles. And thereafter, the bloodline of an ancestry of Heracles just explodes. And in fact, even in ancient Greece, royal and well-to-do elite families would often trace their lineage back to one or more of these great heroes. And so Heracles, this is one of these places where kind of the myth crosses into history, where people could claim lineage from these heroes, and these kinds of stories would explain that to a certain degree. So, like I said, Heracles, part of his tragic journey is that he wants to be civilized, and he wants to settle down, but it's taken away from him. And so he does settle down as a young man with a young woman whose name is usually in the stories Megara, and she's a daughter of Creon, a king of Thebes, and so he's marrying into a royal family. I mean, he's taking, he wants to settle down, but again in an elite manner. So he marries Megara. They have 3 children together, but Hera continues to seek her revenge, and so one day she sends a fit of madness upon him, and in that madness he kills his entire family, kills his wife, and kills his 3 children under the throes of that particular madness. So Heracles now, he has slaughtered his kin. Now, again, technically he's not. We would say he's innocent of this, right? It was a curse sent by the gods, but with the rules of the game, he has spilled the blood of his kin, and that makes him an outcast. He's going to be pursued by the Furies. There's no place that would accept him, and the one place you can go to get that taken care of, as we see in a number of places in Greek mythology, is Apollo's oracle at Delphi. And it's at Delphi where Apollo not only plays the role as the oracle god, but as the god that can cleanse you or give you a path to purifying yourself from this kind of guilt. So Heracles does just that. And it's Apollo who then assigns him these 12 labors, arguably the most famous quests and accomplishments that Heracles does during his life as a hero. And so he's working off his guilt, and I think that's extraordinary. So he doesn't perform the 12 labors to save the princess, to save the town, to save his family. He really does it to save himself. And so it's a really kind of inverted kind of quest. He does the quest simply to work off the blood guilt of slaughtering his family, which is something that he was even out of his hands in the first place. It's so deeply kind of darkly ironic and tragic. So I'm not going to, just to kind of keep this short, I'm not going to bother going through all of these, but the story usually goes is that he was originally assigned 10 labors to perform, and he had to perform them, and he had to prove them for the Eurystheus. That's where that figure from the other branch of the family comes in. And it's a couple of these labors you can see that I've put asterisks by here, like in a sports record book, where are the 2 that were considered not to be counted. So, depending on kind of the source that you read, the rules of the labors that is Heracles had to perform them himself. He could not have help in doing so, and also he could not profit from any of these labors. And so the Linnaean Hydra, this multi-headed snake that he had to behead and then solve the problem of more heads growing back. In some versions of the story, his relative Aeolus helps him, and so Eurystheus said that doesn't count. You got to do another one. And then the Augean stables, where he had to clean out these massive stables that were just piled high with sheep dung and cow manure. He did so with the promise of being paid by King Augeas here, and Eurystheus says, no, that's against the rules, so they don't count. And so he had to do 2 extra, and thus we get the more kind of canonical and the more kind of sacred number 12, which fits better with kind of the Greek conceit of things anyway. very often, critics will kind of split the labors into two groups. You have the first six are kind of the domestic or local labors. These are the ones where he takes care of these problems down in the Peloponnesus, the southern peninsula of Greece, which is kind of the area where Heracles grew up. So here he's kind of the local hero doing good. And then the second six are the ones that take him kind of beyond the bounds of Greece. So sometimes they're called the foreign or otherworldly labors. And so some people say that the domestic labors we see Heracles as a local hero, and then in the second six he becomes kind of a universal hero, and they all kind of build up in their complexity until the very last of the labors, which is the ultimate journey. This is the katabasis. This is the descent into the underworld, where he has to kidnap or borrow at least Cerberus, the three-headed dog, in the underworld. It's just like Odysseus going down into the underworld in Book 11 of the Odyssey. It's the farthest that a hero can go. It's that nearly literal confrontation with death that so many classic, particularly masculine heroes have to get past. So here's a map here. So here's the Greek mainland. Here's the Peloponnesus here. Tiryns is this ancient city, which is usually in the stories. This is Heracles' hometown, where he grows up, and those first six labors here are all in kind of the northern part of the Peloponnesus. And it could very well be that the stories of Heracles began as kind of a local legend of a local strongman hero. Many cultures around the world have the strongman type of heroes. If you think of Samson in the ancient Jewish tradition, if you think of even like in the American folklore, a figure like Paul Bunyan plays that role. It's a very common one. So it's likely that Heracles began his heroic life as kind of a local legendary hero, and then just kind of gained popularity, and then these stories developed and becomes much more of a universal type of hero. Now, so popular did Heracles become that he as his mythology develops, there are so many other these side stories. Or par erga is the Greek term here. Par erga literally means side deeds of Heracles, and it's almost as if storytellers said, "Well, what happened as he was traveling from one labor to the next? Who did he run into?" And so his body of legends just grows organically in a way that fewer other heroes' stories do. It's like Alcestis, the play I asked you to read, is a classic example of this. He was on his way up north to deal with the horses of Diomedes, and he stops off at Admetus' house. Well, what happened there? And he plays this kind of tragic comic role in the resurrection of Alcestis. Cacus was a legend that the Romans told. This is actually the statue group, which is now in one of the central piazzas in Florence. Cacus was kind of a classic troll under the bridge type of character, a trickster, a thieving villain who steals Heracles' cattle as he's traveling between labors, and Heracles hunts him down, takes out his club, and beats him to death. Prometheus, the great Titan, pinned and impaled to the rock, tortured by Zeus. As we talked about early in this class, Heracles, by destiny, comes with his bow and arrow and slaughters the eagle or the vulture that's pecking at Prometheus, and finally frees Prometheus from his long sufferings. Theseus and Pirithous is a comic tale. Theseus, the great Athenian hero, which I won't address in a lecture in this class, but I had you read about. As a young man, before he walks his own hero's journey, he and his friend Pirithous get this not so bright idea into their head that they need to go out and get the wives for themselves, caveman style, and they set their sights very high. So Theseus has his eyes on Helen of Troy, Helen of Sparta. Pirithous almost kind of one-ups him by saying, "No, I want Persephone, queen of the dead, as my bride, and we're going to go steal these brides away from their husbands." So they actually go down into the underworld, and Hades sees these chumps coming and invites them to sit down, and once they sit down, they realize that they can't stand up again. Their buttocks are literally fused to the stone of the seats, and there they are, apparently to be stuck for eternity. Well, the story goes that Heracles comes down to get Cerberus, the three-headed dog of the underworld, and he sees these two idiots sitting there, and they beg him, "Please help us, please help us, please help us." And so Heracles, annoyed, comes over, and Hades says, "All right, you can help Theseus, but Pirithous stays because he had his eyes on my wife." And he grabs Theseus by the arm and rips him out of his chair. And a funny part of the story, as it often goes, is that Theseus leaves the better part of his butt behind on the stone seat, and the Greeks use this to explain Theseus is kind of the quintessential ancient Athenian hero, and so this was explained why Athenian men have no booty. Their butts are very slender because they owe this to the apparently Theseus then passed that on in his DNA thereafter. Yeah, that's not the kind of the usual spin on the myth that you get in the cartoons. And then the Argonauts, he finds his way into other heroes' tales as well. We'll talk about Jason later this week, and Heracles becomes one of the crew of the Argonauts. This kind of Marvel team up of great heroes that goes on the ship with Jason to get the Golden Fleece. Now, after he completes the labors, his tragedy isn't over. It's never really a happy ending for Heracles. Well, I guess it depends on how you define it. We'll get to that in a second. But again, after he kind of cleanses himself of this blood guilt, Heracles again attempts to settle down. He wrestles this sea creature Achilleus to prove himself worthy of the hand of Achilles' daughter Deianira. He wins, and he's going to get married again. And so he goes off with his new bride Deianira, and they get to a river that is too flooded, too fast to cross. And along comes Nessus the centaur. And again, centaurs, all except for the exception of Chiron, centaurs are dangerous and devious and violent, and Nessus is no exception. So Nessus, being a big, large, horse-bodied centaur, says, "Listen, hey, I can help you guys cross. I can just take you one at a time." And they agree. And Nessus takes Deianira across the river, but instead of coming back to get Heracles, he begins to attack, assault, and attempt to rape Deianira. And as the story usually goes, really unlike what this cup painting shows, Heracles, he sees this happening from across the river, so he takes out his bow and arrow, not his club, and he starts firing arrows, and he hits Nessus. These arrows that he's using are the arrow heads. The tips of the arrows are dipped in the poison of the Hydra, this most deadly of poisons. And Nessus, being a centaur, having wisdom that other creatures don't, he realizes that the poison of the Hydra is running through his veins, and realizes that he's done for. But he wants some revenge beyond his death. And so what he does is, before Heracles can make his way across the river, he whispers to Deianira, and he says, "I know about your husband. I know about his sexual proclivities. He's very unfaithful. He's prone to cheat. Do you want to know a way to make him faithful to you forever?" And Deianira is entranced. She says, "Yes." She says, "Well, all you have to do is capture some of my blood in a vial, smear the blood on a cloak, give that cloak to your husband, and he will forever be faithful to you." So Deianira does this naively, not knowing that what she's doing is really setting up the death of Heracles. And so she does this and gives the cloak to her husband, and Heracles unwittingly puts it on. And the cloak is then covered with the blood of Nessus, which is infused with the Hydra's poison. And it clings to his body and slowly melts him to death. So Heracles, his mortal life ends in this agonizing kind of way. And there's some stories that he dies so slowly, this almost reads comically, that he has the wherewithal to build his own funeral pyre and climb on top of it. And he begs someone to light the pyre and put him out of his misery. And nobody wants to do this. Nobody wants to be technically responsible for the death of Heracles. But in some traditions, it's Philoctetes who inherits Heracles' bow, agrees to light the pyre and to put Heracles out of his mercy. So he dies in this agonizing, brutal, and very very sad, kind of pathetic kind of way. I mean, there's so many Greek stories that end this way. The happy ending is such an exception and not the rule. But with Heracles, it's almost like the Greeks, they couldn't let it end there, and so he has an afterlife as a god. And so we've seen this Rubens portrait here from hundreds of years later, that he's taken up into heaven. This is this is Heracles, you can see, with the lion skin and the club, but it mimics the biblical story of Elijah, who is said to have been taken up into heaven in a fiery chariot. So he that interesting kind of cross pollination with Greek mythology and Christianity or Judaism. And there he becomes a minor deity, and he's married off to Hebe, whose name just means feminine youth. Kind of a young, minor, beautiful goddess, and so he kind of has a happy ending on Olympus, but not during his earthly life. He takes on again. Has a really interesting kind of afterlife. The way that he kind of makes his way into history. Alexander the Great, on his coinage, would often depict himself with the lion skin of Heracles over his head as a way of not so subtly saying that I am Heracles reborn, and that was part of his propaganda, that he was from the lineage, from the bloodline of Heracles himself, and that explains his godlike nature and his prowess and his success. Less successfully, Commodus. If you've seen the film Gladiator, Commodus is the Roman emperor. He's kind of the nut job played by Joaquin Phoenix there. He also fancied himself kind of as a modern day or a current day Heracles, and so in his own portraiture, this is the most famous example of it. He would portray himself also as Heracles reborn with the lion skin and the club in his hand. Now, if you remember at the beginning of this presentation, I put it to you that Heracles becomes this kind of everyman, a kind of a pilgrim and a pilgrim's progress, and so the kind of hero that every person could see him or herself in. And there was a famous piece of folktale, a piece of folklore that illustrated this. It's usually called Heracles at the Crossroads. It was famous in written versions, and then it was a favorite. I'll show you a couple of paintings of it. This being the first one. Where the kind of the story is that Heracles comes to a crossroads, and he's met by two figures, and he's offered two paths that he can take. And the one figure is a more kind of severe figure, and she represents virtue, and she points him, the path you have to take is a difficult one. The long, difficult, rocky path, easy to stumble and fall, but ultimately, if you make it to the top, you will achieve truth and wisdom. Here, represented by a white horse, which is a symbol of philosophical enlightenment from Plato's dialogues. It's not pretty. It's easy, it's difficult, but ultimately the payoff is the better one. And so there lies, philosophy and literature. Now the other figure represents vice, the easy path, the garden path. You can see it's lush and green over here, and where this woman here kind of appears in a more kind of masculinized way. Here we have kind of a Venus, an Aphrodite. Her gown is see-through. She represents, sexual temptation. Over here you see the masks of theater, and you see the instruments of music. They represent kind of the temptation of the lower popular arts, which take you away from God and away from truth. And the path is easy, so virtue's pointing up, and voice is saying, just take this nice, beautiful garden path with all these beautiful things and beautiful women. And Heracles is at the center, and he doesn't know what to do. Now, in most tellings of this story, ultimately he makes the difficult choice, and he treads the path of virtue. So the tragic Heracles wins out over the comic Heracles. So he becomes kind of a figure that you can be inspired by, and you can kind of follow him up the path of virtue. Here's another one from a couple hundred years later of the painting I just showed you. Again, the choice of Heracles. Here too, it's a similar kind of thing. Heracles is at a moment of indecision in the middle, and he's flanked by two figures. Here, our figure of virtue is really Athena or Minerva. See the shield and the spear and the helmet, and she's pointing up here to the temple. Right? She's pointing to, virtue, religion, philosophy, but it's a long road and it's difficult to get there. And on the right here we have, again, I said this is Minerva or Aphrodite. This is very likely Venus or Aphrodite. The rose is a symbol of Aphrodite, and she's again kind of more or less kind of in his lap, representing sexual temptation. And then again down here, just like the other painting, we have a tambourine and a recorder. I mean, if ever there was an instrument from hell, it's the recorder. Am I right? And songs and literature, kind of vices, popular. You see money down there. I never noticed that before, but money and temptation. She represents the easy path, and over here represents the hard choice of virtue. And so he's a philosophical figure. He's a figure that kind of represents all of us, all of our foibles, all of our failings, all of our temptations. But he's ultimately someone that can lead us to the light of philosophy and truth. All right, that's all I got. See you soon.